Pastor Phillip.
Well, it's just another day that the Lord has kept us. Another day that the Lord has made, and we will rejoice and be glad in it. I'm Pastor Suber. Thanks for joining me. You know, there are a few things that are more formidable than a group of people who come together with one mind, one common cause, pulling all of their resources and strengths together to make something happen. Even more greater than that is when the people of God come together in partnership to make the will of God revealed in our world today, who allow God to come in. But even still, I hold that one of the greatest examples, one of the most precious partnerships that you can see is when parents come together, allowing God to have dominion in their household and over their affairs. And such is the case with Isaac and his wife Rebekah. And we want to talk about that as we go back to the 25th chapter of Genesis, and we're going to pick up at the 22nd verse. So let's read that and then let's talk through it. In Genesis 25, beginning at verse 22, here's what the text says. The children struggled together within her, speaking about Rebekah. And she said, if it is thus, why is this happening to me? So she went to inquire of the Lord. And the Lord said to her, 2 nations are in your womb, and 2 people from within you shall be divided. And the one shall be stronger than the other, and the older shall rule or serve, the older shall serve the youngest. Speaking about partnering together in God's promise. The text lends itself to this principle that 2 people, 2 God-fearing people, are aware that God is working in their lives. Scriptures lend themselves to the power of 2 coming together under the umbrella of God. Ecclesiastic says 2 are better than 1. Amos asks this rhetorical question, can 2 walk together unless they agree? We have seen the power, both good and bad, when people come together. The Tower of Babel, earlier on in Genesis, when God's order was for the people to spread out and repopulate the earth, but they came together and decided that they were going to build this great tower, and they were fortified and making progress, and God had to come down and confuse their language because together they were fortified. We saw in the book of Acts when Ananias and Sapphira came together to deceive the church over what they were giving as an offering to the church. And because of it, tragically, they both were struck dead in the presence of the apostle because they lied to the Spirit. See, there is power when people come together, but I hold that the greatest power is when 2 parents come together and allow God to have his way in their home. So last Sunday, when we read verse 19 through 21, we saw God at work in the lives of Isaac. We rehearsed that about how God came to work, calling his promise into existence by bringing life out of Abraham and Sarah in their old age. And for that reason, we entitled last Sunday's message, The Product of Promise, which was Isaac. But Isaac wasn't in it by himself. People were working together who believed in God's promise so that God's promise would be fulfilled. I believe that God is not in the business of dragging us and forcing us to be a part of his plan. Though God is sovereign, God can do whatever he wants to do, use whoever he wants to use. But I believe that God is calling on a people who are bending to his will. So we had so much to say about the faith of Isaac, who knew that God was in control of all that was happening and the excitement of knowing that he himself was the product of God's promise, having gone to God in prayer about his wife. Now, in partnering together in God's promise, the first thing that stuck out for me, and I didn't mention it last Sunday because I want to save it for today, and now I'm sharing with you, that we ought to be praying, every husband and wife ought to be praying one for another. We ought to be praying about God's will for one another. Not a selfish prayer, but a prayer that God would produce in our spouses all that he has said they would be, all that he has ordained for them, all that he is calling them to be. It's an unselfish prayer because everybody has a role to play, and none really supersedes the other. So it's not all about Isaac, because there needs to be a Rebekah. So let me say it in another way. All Isaacs are incomplete without a Rebekah. All Rebeccas are incomplete without an Isaac. We need the both working together, and both not be feeling inferior one to the other, but both appreciating the role of one another. So Isaac prayed for Rebekah because Rebekah was in partnership with Isaac concerning God's promise. They were working together. We can recall about the time that Rebekah was chosen, about how miraculously God chose Rebekah. And in my mind, I think about and rehearse how Rebekah must have felt to learn that she was chosen of God to fulfill this dynamic role that was designed just for Rebekah. We may not be an Isaac, we may not be a Rebekah, but you are who God made you be, and there will never be another you, and nobody can beat you being you. God made you for who he has purposed you to be, and has assigned to you what is for you. So it's more than when we say, the blessings, what God has for me is for me. It's more than just the blessings, but it's the steps that God has ordered for you. It's the role that you play in life. At least I digress. Every husband has a role and a duty toward his wife. Every wife has a role and duty toward her husband. And it's not until we come together, husband and wife comes together and recognize that they are partners in God's promise, that they begin to truly excel, that they really begin to be the shoulder for one another through the presence of God. What do we see the example of them being on the same page? Well, though it's years later, after Isaac prayed the prayer that for Rebekah, that she would conceive, that Rebekah in fact conceives. And Rebekah knows that although that there was this delay, she's not confused as to how it came about. She knows that it was God's perfect timing. She knows that it's God's perfect will, the reason that she is now pregnant, the reason why she is now with child. And not only ought we to pray one for another, but we need to be clear about what God is doing in our lives. Let me just reiterate that. Husbands ought to recognize when God is working in the lives of your wife. And wives, please recognize when God is working in the lives of your husband. And don't let Satan be the deterring factor. Don't let Satan come in and cause a husband and a wife to be a stumbling block for one another when you know that God is at work. And sometimes we become stumbling blocks because we believe that what God is doing in the spouse's life seems to be more important, to gain more notoriety and Yes, I'm saying that sometimes selfishness gets the best of us, but we ought to recognize that God has a plan, a will, and a role for each of us. So don't be one another's stumbling block, but be one another's encourager that they become all that God wants them to be. Rebecca is with child. She recognized um, that Isaac has prayed and God has answered prayer, so she knows that it's God's doing. But here's what I want to tell you, that when God's promises are in progress, things begin to change and some things cause discomfort. And there's often discomfort associated with good growth. There are always growing pains. Every relationship goes through something because it is coming together. It is being molded and mended together. So there's always this breaking away or this conflict that happens. That's a part of it. And I want to say to you that sometimes people are so quick to say at the first glimmer of problems, of conflicts, people are so quick to run away. But I want to encourage you, stay there, hang in there, knowing that you are partnering together in the promise of God. This was not a pain that Isaac felt physically, but no doubt that he was involved in the emotional aspect, but it was a physical discomfort to Rebecca. So now I'm talking to the women here now. There are those times when those physical discomforts become overwhelming and you feel like you're all by yourself. But here you can take a cue from Rebecca. Rebecca asked the question, and in the question, she's making a very bold and concise statement. Here's the question. The text says there was struggling that was going on within her. To this point, she doesn't know that there's twins. She's only just blessed and excited about the fact that she conceived, the fact that she's about to give an heir to her husband, the fact that she is in God's promise. That's her excitement right now. But then there is this complication that happens within her. And she's asked this question that many of us ask, and here it is. If this is to be, then why am I having this problem? Or we can change that question around, reword it in many ways. If it's God's will for us to move forward, why are we coming against this brick wall? If God loves me, why is he allowing this to happen? If it's God's will, why is there so much difficulty that we're facing in trying to do something that we know that it's God's will? There are many different ways that we can ask the question, but many have asked that question, and some are still asking that question today. But here's what you ought to find the blessing in the fact that you have to ask. That means that God is at work. That means that God is bringing you through something, and that your faith is being strengthened. It is being proven because God is at work in you. And that's why James says, what will count it joy, when you fall into direst temptation. In other words, when things get tough, rather than becoming discouraged, get excited, because God is doing something in you, for you, and through you. She asked that question, and she knows this, that she's not, although the pain, the discomfort is physical, but yet spiritually she knows she's not alone. Not only does she have a partnership with Isaac, but that they're in partnership with God. They are fulfilling God's promise. And here's one thing I want to say to you. If anybody knows what's going on in something that God has initiated, it would be God. Nobody knows better what God is doing than God himself. And God is moving, God is changing, God is delivering, God is transitioning, taking us through something to bring us to something. Oh, I'm excited about that. I wanted to say to you that the last time that Evelyn and I came through some difficulties, we knew just by way of experience that God was at work. In the past, earlier on, when things would happen, when difficult things would happen, we would become upset and just kind of going through the normal emotions and whatever. But we have learned that when things began to happen, because we're in partnership with God, we know that God is in the mix. Whether it is his intended will or permissive will, we know that God is in the mix, and we know that God is in control. Regardless to how things turn out, what's going on, we know that God is in control. And I believe that there's some witnesses today who are listening to my voice who can say we too have gone through a lot of ups and downs. And the one thing that we have learned, no matter what, that because we are in partnership with God, God is in control, and God always knows what's best for us. So what does she do? Does she go and consult others to find out what's going on? I'm not saying others may not be able to give you good advice, but I just want to hold and press this point that if anybody knows what God is doing, it would be God himself. What does she have under her belt? Rebecca have under her belt? Rebecca knows that, first of all, God initiated this. It was in response to my partner Isaac's prayer that God initiated. I know that God has included me in his promise from the moment that they came, Abraham's servant, came looking for me. So I know that whatever's going on, which causes me to say, if it is to be so, I know that it is God at work. And so the next thing that we see is that Rebecca goes to God in prayer, just like her partner. Just like Isaac went to God in prayer because he was concerned about what or the progression of God's promise. At this point, Rebecca is concerned about a possible problem that may slow down or threatens God's promise. Every mother, a woman who has ever given birth or attempted to give birth could empathize or sympathize with Rebecca. There's so many individuals, so many women who have struggled, who have had difficult birth, who are pregnancies. There are some who end in tragedy, some that end with a stillborn, who could say, I know the fear. I know the anxiety that sets in. And sometimes that comfort cannot be found outside, but certainly comfort and clarity can be found with God. And so she goes and she prays to God. Now here's the thing that's so awesome. When we're partnering with in the promises of God, not only partnering with our mate, our spouse, but partnering with God himself, co-laborers, if you will. But oftentimes that we're surprised. You see, when we find out all that God is doing, we know that God does incredible things. But did you know that God does exceeding and abundantly above all we can ask or think? Watch Rebecca. Rebecca goes with the concern that she is having difficulties with a pregnancy because they're struggling. But even the word struggling indicates two opposing forces. And it was mind-blowing for her to learn that God wasn't just blessing her with one, but with two. Let me say this. Sometimes we become so consumed in trying to figure out the problems of the little things, that we fail to see that the reason why there is discomfort is because the blessing is bigger than what we thought. Sometimes we become so tied down behind the smaller things that we can't open our eyes immediately to the reality that God is doing a bigger thing. She was just glad to know for the one, but she had no idea that the struggle was because there were two. It's just mind-blowing to me, and I love to say it, how God is able to do above what we can ask or even think. It had never entered her mind that there were two. But God is fulfilling. God is progressing in his promise. He is doing exceeding and abundantly. But what was wise about it is that Rebecca knew that God was in control. God knew the answer of what was going on. And Rebecca ended up opening herself up to the exceeding and abundant blessings of God. Not one, but two. Not one nation, but two nations. And though they will be struggling, and that God had providentially set forth an order, yet she recognized that it was in her, it was for her, and it was through her that God was going to do this tremendous blessing. Let me summarize it by saying this. It's a blessing when parents work together to bring about, to usher in, and unfold the promise of God. For that reason, husbands and wives ought to always pray for one another, not selfishly, but that the will of God would be revealed in one another. That God would bring about all that he has ordained for the individual. One role is just as important as the next. There is no Isaac without the Rebecca. There's no Rebecca without the Isaac. They were one in partnership, fulfilling the promise of God. But there would be no promise if there were no God. Here's what I want to say. Partnership is important. And each one of us has to have this singleness of mind. And because by nature we all have different concepts, our singleness ought to be around the will of God. We ought to all be God-minded. Let's not work against one another, but let's work together for God to fulfill his good and his perfect will. You know, Paul talked about not being unequally yoked with unbelievers. God has a plan and a purpose for our life, but we won't know it until we come under the umbrella of what God's will is. And I want to encourage all of the Rebeccas. I want to encourage all of the Isaacs that, you know, God is doing a wonderful work in your lives, and there will be difficulty, but God has the answer. And don't become so stagnated with the one that you are not open to receiving the multiple blessings that God has for you. Well, I hope this has been a blessing to you. Until we meet again, may God bless you and may God keep you. Would you repeat after me? Therefore, my beloved brethren, be ye steadfast, unmovable, always abounding in the works of the Lord, for as much as you know that your labor is not in vain in the Lord. I'm Pastor Sue.
Now, our weekly announcements. Do you want to learn more about the Bible? Wednesday night is a night for insight. Join us via Facebook or YouTube at 6 p.m.
Much prayer, much power. Join us Fridays for Prayer Line at noon.
This quarter, we are supporting R.H. Boyd, a Black-owned Sunday school publisher. For your new Sunday school book, go to Amazon.com or contact us about mailing out a hard copy. Then follow along with Reverend Eric Carter for 6 p.m. Saturday Sunday School Review. Sharing the gospel has never been easier. Make sure you're subscribed to our Facebook and YouTube channels and then share. Our church is supported by tithes and offering. Text GIVE to 832-303-8442 or visit Strait.life for more ways to give. Thanks again for listening, and we pray that your life has been changed by our encounter today.